You have seen the moment the branch went into the ground. You know which crop it was. You know why it was chosen. But knowing what was planted is only the beginning of the story. The harder question, the one that archaeologists have spent decades piecing together from burned floors and carbonized fragments and ancient soil, is what happened next. How did they actually grow it? Not in the modern sense, with tools and irrigation systems and rows of carefully managed trees. In the most fundamental sense possible. How did a group of people who had never farmed before, who had no tradition of cultivation to draw from, manage to take a single branch and turn it into a living, producing, harvested tree? The answer requires you to understand something important. The people of Gilgal were not guessing. They were applying thousands of years of accumulated observational knowledge about the natural world to a new and deliberate purpose. Everything they did was grounded in something they already understood. The act was new. The knowledge behind it was ancient. Start with the ground. Before any cutting went into the soil, someone had to choose where to put it. This was not a random decision. The people of the lower Jordan Valley had spent generations learning to read the landscape with a precision most modern people would find astonishing. They knew which patches of ground retained moisture after rainfall. They knew where the soil was darkest and deepest, rich with sediment deposited by seasonal flooding from the Jordan River. They knew which slopes caught the morning sun. And they knew where the springs ran. That last fact was the most important of all. A fig cutting pushed into dry, compacted soil will fail. The roots that emerge from the base of a branch in the first weeks are fragile, newly formed structures with no tolerance for drought. They need consistent moisture, not flooding, which would drown them, but a steady dampness that keeps the root zone alive while the new tree establishes itself. The springs that ran from the limestone hillsides of the Jordan Valley provided exactly that. Cold, clean water emerging from the ground at a constant rate regardless of season. Dr. Mordecai Kislev of Bar Ilan University, one of the researchers who analyzed the Gilgal 1 figs, noted that the placement of the settlement itself, its proximity to freshwater springs, and the Jordan River floodplain, was not accidental. The inhabitants understood that water access was not simply a matter of drinking. It was a matter of what the soil could sustain. Site selection was the first act of cultivation. Before the cutting was prepared, before it was planted, before a single root had formed, someone walked the ground near the settlement and chose a spot where the soil was dark and damp and the spring water reached. That act of looking and choosing was itself a form of farming knowledge. Now the cutting. A fig branch, suitable for propagation, had to come from the right part of the tree at the right time. Not any branch would do. Thick, mature, woody branches from the previous season's growth were far more likely to survive being removed and placed in soil. Thin, young green shoots tended to wilt before roots could form. Modern horticultural research confirms what those ancient cultivators appear to have understood intuitively. A 2025 study published in the journal Plants, examining propagation of Ficus carica, found that longer, woody hardwood cuttings from mature branches consistently produced stronger root systems and higher survival rates. The ancient farmers of Gilgal were not performing controlled experiments, but they were observant enough to notice which cuttings survived and which did not, and they adjusted accordingly. Timing mattered too. Fig trees lose their leaves in winter and enter dormancy. During dormancy, stored energy in the woody tissue is at its highest concentration, and the hormones that trigger root growth are most active. Taking a cutting in late winter or early spring, just before the growing season began, gave it the best possible chance of rooting before the summer heat of the Jordan Valley arrived. Once the cutting was taken, the preparation was minimal but precise. The lower end needed to be clean. Any crushed or damaged tissue at the cut end could introduce rot before roots formed. The people of Gilgal had finally worked flint blades, confirmed at PPNA sites across the Jordan Valley, sharp enough to make an exact clean cut through mature fig wood. Then it went into the ground, not thrown in, pushed carefully into soil that had been loosened. The ground along the spring edges and the floodplain margins would have been soft enough in the wet season to work with a pointed stick or a flat-edged stone. Archaeologist Ian Kite of the University of Notre Dame, who has studied pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the Jordan Valley extensively, has documented the presence of simple digging tools at PPNA sites, implements capable of breaking soil to a depth sufficient for planting a substantial branch. The cutting went in deep enough that a significant length of woody stem was below the surface, in contact with moist soil where roots would form. The portion above the ground needed to be long enough to carry leaves. Those early leaves were not decorative. They were essential. Within days of planting, the cutting's leaves would begin pulling energy from sunlight, converting it into the sugars the branch needed to power root formation underground. Remove the leaves too aggressively, and the cutting starved. Leave too many, and it desiccated faster than its not yet formed roots could compensate. This balance was something the cultivators learned by watching and adjusting across seasons. The kind of knowledge that passes from the person who first planted to the younger members of the community who watched and helped and eventually took over. Watering came next, and it was consistent. In the weeks immediately after planting, the cutting had no root system. The only water available was what moved upward through the branch from the soil below. The Jordan Valley in the early Holocene received more rainfall than today. Climate reconstructions for the pre-pottery Neolithic EI confirmed significantly wetter conditions, but rainfall alone would not have been reliable enough on the hot valley floor. Someone was responsible for the cutting. Someone checked the soil at its base. Someone carried water from the spring and poured it carefully when the ground dried. This was not a sophisticated irrigation system. It was something more fundamental, a commitment, a person or a group of people who returned to this specific branch in this specific spot and gave it what it needed to survive. That commitment, returning, checking, watering, watching, was a new kind of relationship between human beings and the plant world. Hunter-gatherers had always observed plants, but they had never been responsible for one. The planted cutting created an obligation that wandering had never required. You could not walk away from it for long. It needed you to come back. Roots began forming within the first weeks after planting, emerging from the nodes of the stem in contact with moist soil. By the end of the first growing season, a successful cutting would have produced a small but functional root network and a flush of new green growth above, fresh leaves emerging from dormant buds along the stem, responding to the warmth of the Jordan Valley spring. But it was still not a tree. Not yet. The young plant was vulnerable. Surrounding wild vegetation, grasses, shrubs, and the proto-weeds documented by Professor Ehud Weiss at Neolithic sites across the region competed directly with the young fig for the same water and soil nutrients. A cutting surrounded by dense wild growth could be outcompeted and killed before it ever produced fruit. This is where clearing came in. The people of Gilgal cleared the ground around their planted cuttings, with hands, with digging sticks, with sharp-edged flat stones. They pulled competing plants from the root zone, loosening the earth and improving its capacity to hold water. Professor Gordon Hillman of University College London, whose research on early Neolithic plant management remains foundational in the field, has argued that these clearing practices were not sophisticated crop science. They were intuitive responses by highly observant people to what they could see in front of them. The plant was weaker when surrounded. It was stronger when cleared. The logic was direct and observable. This was the origin of weeding. The first full growing season passed, then another. Fig trees grown from cuttings typically begin producing fruit within 2 to 3 years. The community at Gilgal was not depending solely on the planted figs to survive each day. Archaeological evidence from the site shows they continued gathering wild barley, oats, acorns, and pistachios from the surrounding landscape. The cultivated figs were an investment, not yet a primary food source. The community had time to wait because they were not betting everything on a single harvest. When the first fruit finally came, it arrived in waves. Harvard Magazine, reporting on Bar Yosef's original research, confirmed that the parthenocarpic fig trees cultivated at Gilgal produced 3 crops per year, an early breba crop in summer on the previous year's branches, and a main crop in late summer and autumn on the current season's new growth. 3 harvests from a single tree every year made the fig an extraordinary food source by any standard available to early Neolithic communities. The harvest itself was direct. Ripe parthenocarpic figs stayed on the branch rather than dropping early. They could be picked at peak ripeness at the moment of maximum sweetness, directly from the branch by hand. And what could not be eaten fresh was left to dry in the hot valley air, its water content evaporating, its sugars concentrating into a dense, shelf-stable food that could be stored for months. Archaeological evidence from PPNA storage features across the Jordan Valley, documented by researchers including Ian Kite and Bill Finlayson of the Council for British Research in the Levant, confirms the presence of dedicated food storage structures at early Neolithic sites. Dried figs were precisely the kind of calorie-dense, spoilage-resistant food built to fill them. Think about what had been built. Not a field, not a farm in the sense you would recognize today. A small, managed grove of extraordinary trees growing near a freshwater spring, tended by people who returned to them regularly, watered them, cleared the ground around them, and harvested across 3 seasons every year. It was not much to look at. A few young fig trees beside a spring in a narrow valley. Thin roots reaching into dark soil. New branches catching the Jordan Valley sun. Fruit forming in the summer heat without any wasp, without any pollination, without any of the machinery of wild reproduction. Just a branch, planted by a human hand, growing because someone came back to water it. That was the first farm, not a field of waving grain, not an organized system of irrigation. A few trees beside a spring, tended by people who had decided that the future was worth investing in. One careful act of returning at a time. Everything that came after, every farm, every orchard, every harvest festival, every civilization built on the surplus of cultivated food, traces its roots to that grove, to those trees, to the hands that cleared the ground and carried water and waited through the seasons for the first fruit to come. The branch went in, the roots followed, the tree grew, and from that moment forward, the human story was a farming story.